Welcome to the deep dive, where we take your source material and turn complexity into clarity. Today, we are doing something pretty ambitious.
We're cracking open what is basically a spiritual instruction manual, a very, very technical one.
Yeah, this isn't just philosophy. We're diving into Canto 2, Chapter 2 of a foundational text, and it's a step-by-step guide.
It is. The sage Sukha is laying out a roadmap for anyone who wants to consciously transcend the material world. It's incredibly detailed.
So our mission today is to walk through all 37 verses of this instruction set. We're going to move systematically from the initial mental prep.
Right, the radical detachment.
Exactly. All the way to these two really distinct paths for, leaving the body. And then we land on this simplifying conclusion. It's dense, but I think you'll have a really clear picture by the end.
And Sukha starts by setting a just incredibly high bar for focus, right in verse 1.
He does. He talks about Brahma, the creator.
Who apparently lost his memory, the Samiti, just for a moment. But he got it back through this intense concentration, this Tarantaya.
And only then, only with that laser focus, could he create the universe with what the text calls a determined intellect. Vyavasaya Bhutiya.
So the message right from the get-go is that focus is the engine. It's the absolute foundation for everything, creation and liberation.
But if focus is the foundation, the text immediately warns you about its biggest enemy.
Distraction, yeah.
Right.
But a specific kind of distraction.
Getting stuck in language itself, the Shubda Brahman. I find that part fascinating.
It's a huge paradox, right?
Yeah.
Verses 2 and 3 are basically saying, hey, you're reading this text, but don't get lost in the words. It warns that people who just wander around in the path of sound, lost in Maya and their own, mental habits.
Their vasanaya.
Yeah, right. They completely miss the real meaning. Na vindate arthan. They're just looking at the map, not the actual territory.
So it's a warning against endless debate. That kind of intellectual exercise is just fruitless labor, parashramai, for the wise.
Exactly. Realization isn't found in talking about the truth. It's a call for vigilance, apramata, against wasting your mental energy.
And that idea of not wasting energy flows right into the next verses on detachment. And these are pretty radical.
Oh, they are. Verses 4 and 5 use these really harsh, almost confrontational questions to make the point.
Yeah, they really challenge every modern comfort, like why struggle for a bed, a kashipo, when you have the earth, the kaitao?
Or why do you need pillows, Upabharavachi, when your own arm will do?
It's the ultimate pushback on convenience culture. If you can hold food in your cupped hands, Aniello, why do you need fancy dishes?
And the clothing one. If bark, or even just the directions, meaning the sky itself, can be your clothes, Digvalkala, why are you chasing after silk? It makes you question every single thing you think you need.
And verse 5 really doesn't pull any punches. It asks why any enlightened person would go chasing wealth from the arrogant and proud, the Dhanaduma Dandan.
When nature provides everything, water, shelter in caves, alms, it's all there.
So you clear out all that external clutter first. And only then can you shift your focus inward.
Which is exactly what happens in verse 6.
Okay, so where does that focus go?
It shifts to the Lord within, Bhagavanananta, who's described as the dearest object, prior sutho, that you can find right inside your own heart.
And devotion to him, Pajeta, is the only attachment that actually frees you. It leads to the end of all suffering.
And verse 7 closes that whole section with this stark moral question. It basically asks, who but an animal, a pashu, would ignore this path?
Well, watching everyone else drown in their own misery. The river Vattori as a metaphor for hell, really.
Right, it's a powerful motivation. So, okay, detachment is set, the object of focus is set. Now, the text gets into the how, the actual practice.
The mental discipline, Dhuran, concentration.
Yes. And this is the primary tool. Starting in verse 8, it gets very specific. It's not an abstract concept. You have to fix your mind on the four-armed puru in the heart.
And it's described as being thumb-sized, Pradeshamatra.
It is. This is the genius of it. Your mind wants something concrete to hold on to, and the text gives it this perfect, rich, visual anchor.
The details are incredible. The conch, wheel, mace, and lotus. The yellow garments. What was the description? Like the filaments of a kadamba flower.
Kadamba kinjal kapishagavasadam.
Yeah.
Then you have the gold ornaments, the sparkling crown and earrings, the kostuba jewel, a flower garland.
And maybe the most important part, the smile. The gentle, joyful, protective smile. Adina Lila Hasatel Inozad.
Every single one of those details is designed to stop your mind from wandering. And the goal in verse 12 is to hold that inner gaze, kiyata, until the mind becomes absolutely unshakable. Yavan mano taranyavati hatu.
But it's not just stare at this image in your mind. Verses 13 and 14 give you a method, a progression.
It's like a workout for your mind, yeah. It's sequential. You don't just grasp the whole form at once. You focus on each limb, ekeshugani, one by one.
Starting from the feet, the padati, and moving all the way up.
All the way up to the smile. Yavad dasitam. And as you master one spot, chitam chitam stanam, you move to the next.
And that's what purifies the intellect, shutyati tiryata yata. You're forcing the mind to submit to this really specific, difficult task.
And it's not a one-time thing. You have to maintain this practice at the end of all your actions, kriyavasana, until that genuine devotion, bhakti yoga, just arises on its own.
Which leads us right into the most technical part of the whole chapter, the conscious exit.
The utkranti. Yeah, this is where it goes from mental practice to spiritual physiology. This is the sage preparing for the moment of death.
And the requirements are so clear. A steady, comfortable posture, control of the life airs, the pradhan. And crucially, the mind can't be attached to a specific time or place for the departure.
That's it. The timing doesn't matter because the work is already done. You're ready to go at any moment.
And verse 16 describes that final mental act. You regulate your mind with pure intelligence, merge your individual soul into the supreme self, and you find this profound peace, labdopashantya. It's a deliberate, willed act of dissolving.
But dissolving into what? Verses 17 and 18 define the destination, the supreme vikava state.
A place where time itself has no power. Not even the gods who control the universe have any sway there.
It's beyond all the building blocks of reality, beyond the three modes, beyond the primary material cause, prahanam, beyond even cosmic intelligence. It's pure being.
And how do you get there? I thought this was fascinating. It mentions the neti path.
Not this, the path of intellectual negation. But it says you have to do that while also wholeheartedly embracing the Lord in your heart.
So it's radical detachment and radical love, both at the same time.
Exactly. And then we get the anatomy of the exit.
This part is wild. Verses 19 to 21. This isn't theory. It's a very specific physical technique for raising the life air, the prata.
It's highly physical. It says to press the anus with the heel, svaparni pichagudam, and then you raise the prata up through 6 centers.
And the route is mapped out like a spiritual nervous system. You guide the breath from the navel up to the heart, then the chest.
Then to the root of the palate, and finally you bring it to rest right between the eyebrows.
And you hold it there for a very specific short time, musotaram, while being completely detached. And then the final act.
You pierce the crown of the head, nirvidya murdhan, and exit. That's the supreme state. Game over. You don't come back.
Which sounds, incredibly difficult. Not everyone can achieve that level of mastery, so the text has to address that, right?
It does. And that brings us to the second path, the gradual one, krama mukti.
Okay, so this is for people who are still disciplined, but maybe still have some desires, like for higher celestial realms.
Precisely. Verses 22 to 26 cover this. If you choose this route, you actually take your mind and senses with you on the journey.
And this path isn't for just anyone. It's the path of the Yogeshvaras, masters of yoga. And it's achieved through knowledge and austerity, not just, rituals.
And the cosmic geography it describes is just immense.
It's like a spiritual travelogue. You go up through the luminous Sumneti, past the sphere of Vyo to the Sishumara Kakra.
The stellar sphere, yeah. The axis of the whole cosmos.
And you eventually reach the realm of Brahma Paramihao. But even that, the highest material realm, is temporary. You stay there for a kalpa, which is an almost unimaginable amount of time.
It's the ultimate celestial layover. But verse 26 is key. Even from there, you eventually witness the entire universe being consumed by fire, Makhanalena Dandayamana, and only then do you leave that place for final liberation.
There's such a poignant detail in verse 27. It says, in that realm, you're free from sorrow, old age, death, all of it, except for one thing.
Pity.
Yeah. Pity for the suffering of everyone you left behind. That compassion is still there.
And then we get the final stage of this gradual path, which is this systematic shedding of all your elemental covering.
It's like a cognitive deconstruction of yourself. You merge your identity from water into fire, into air, and finally into the vastness of the sky.
You're mentally reversing the process of creation. You're unidentifying with matter. You even merge your senses, like smell and taste, back into the subtle elements they came from. It's an intellectual unwinding of your own reality.
And the ultimate merger is when your mental body, the Manomaya, merges into intelligence, and that intelligence merges back into the self. That's when you hit that state of peaceful bliss. You achieve the divine destination, Bhagavati Gatya, and the cycle is finally broken.
So we have these two eternal paths, the immediate, super difficult yogic exit, and this long, gradual, disciplined cosmic journey. But this is where the chapter pulls its biggest twist.
Right, this is the paradox. Why spend 15 verses giving us these incredibly complex anatomical cosmic roadmaps?
If the conclusion just throws it all out the window.
Well, not throws it out, but it offers a much, much simpler alternative.
I think the complex paths are there to show you what's possible through sheer mastery, the proof of concept. But then Sukha delivers the real takeaway for everyone else.
He says there is no more auspicious path, Nahyatonya Shivapanta, than just Bhakti Yoga, simple devotion to Vasudeva.
It's the ultimate shortcut. Verse 34 says that the Lord himself reviewed all the scriptures 3 times over and concluded that the absolute best path is the one that just leads to love, to reti, for the Supreme Self.
The goal isn't mastery of the body, it's devotion of the heart.
And this is reinforced in the last few verses. It says Vasudeva is right there in all beings, Sarva Bhuti Lakoita. You can perceive him everywhere with your own intelligence.
Which leads to the final commandment, the one that's actionable for you and me, not just for some master yogi on a mountaintop.
The most essential duty for all people, is to constantly hear, glorify, and remember Hari, Chotavya Smartavya, with your whole being.
And that closing image is so beautiful. It says those who just drink the nectar of these stories, Ekathamata, through their ears.
They purify their minds, a mind that's otherwise polluted by the material world. And just by doing that, they reach his lotus feet. It completely bypasses the need for all that complex prud-raising business.
So for you, the learner, this whole deep dive really boils down to a profound choice. The text honors the incredibly difficult path of yogic mastery, but it concludes that the simplest, and maybe the most powerful path, is just purifying your mind through constant engagement with these stories, with the source of knowledge.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. It sort of bridges the beginning of the chapter with the end. Given how incredibly complex that final yogic exit is, raising pride, merging elements, what practical steps can you take today, right now, based on those early verses about detachment, to make sure your mind is already used to letting go, so that when that final moment comes, releasing your attachments feels like a psychological certainty, not a last-minute physical struggle.
So today, we're going to dive into a pretty profound ancient text. It's basically a roadmap for the ultimate journey, a path toward pure consciousness and, self-realization. And what's really interesting is that it all starts by questioning the very things we think we need to be happy. And really, this is the question that kicks the whole thing off, right? It's this timeless, universal question that pushes us to look beyond all the temporary stuff for something that actually lasts. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the mindset that even starts this journey. Then we'll get into the specific practices, explore the super technical process of how a yogi leaves the world, and what happens next on their cosmic trip. And then we'll land on what the text says is the most direct path of all. All right, so where does a journey like this even begin? Well, it doesn't start with a step. It starts with a question. And for the yogi, that question is aimed right at the heart of our day-to-day existence. The text tells us that the starting point is this moment of just seeing things clearly. A wise person, called a kavi, looks around and sees this strange paradox. We spend so much energy chasing things that only give us a fleeting sense of satisfaction. And that realization, that's the first step off the hamster wheel. And check out how the text puts it. It's so simple, it's brilliant. This isn't about, punishing yourself. It's a logical argument for a kind of radical self-sufficiency. It's asking, why do we complicate our lives with all these artificial needs when the world around us already provides the basics? And it just keeps going with this idea. The main point here is that nature is generous. A wise person sees this and decides not to get tangled up in the anxiety of getting and keeping stuff they don't really need. It's this detachment that frees up a huge amount of mental and spiritual energy. Okay, so if your mind isn't constantly chasing external comforts anymore, where does it turn? Well, this is where the text gives us a really powerful internal anchor, a very specific practice to focus on. And here's the how-to. That wandering mind is given a single point of focus. This practice is actually called dharana, which basically just means holding your mind steady on one thing. And in this case, that one thing is a divine form, visualized in incredible detail. The text really invites the meditator to build this image piece by piece. You start from the top, a beautiful, smiling face, captivating eyes that are compared to lotus petals, and all these radiant adornments. Every single detail is designed to attract the mind and hold it there.
And the visualization just keeps going, getting more and more detailed. You've got 4 arms holding different symbols, a fragrant flower garland, precious gems. See, by focusing on such a detailed and beautiful form, the mind literally has no room to wander off. It just gets completely absorbed.
You see, there's a system to it. The yogi moves their attention methodically from one part of this form to the next, usually starting from the feet and moving up. And as the mind gets steady on each part, the intelligence itself actually becomes purified. All right, now we're getting into the really mind-bending part of the text. After years and years of practice, what happens when it's time for a perfected yogi to actually leave this world? This is so important to understand. The text is describing something that isn't a passive death. It's a voluntary, fully conscious act of departure. And this is only possible for someone who has achieved total mastery over their vital energies, or life airs. These are the subtle forces that keep the body going. So here's how it's done. It's a step-by-step internal climb. Using just their will, the yogi guides that life force upwards through specific energy centers in the body. This whole methodical journey ends with the soul consciously exiting through the highest point, the very crown of the head. But here's the thing, leaving the body, that's not the end of the journey, not even close. For this yogi, it's just the beginning of an absolutely incredible voyage through the entire universe. Because the yogi leaves by their own power and is free from, the weight of karma, their soul isn't just forced into another body. Instead, it travels along this specific glowing energy channel called the Sushumna, heading up towards the highest realms of the cosmos. The text basically maps out this cosmic road trip. The soul passes through different celestial spheres, goes even beyond the planets of these great sages, and ultimately transcends the whole cycle of creation and destruction to enter this eternal spiritual place. Now, this is the final stage of the trip, ultimate purification. To get into a purely spiritual reality, the soul has to let go of its very last layers of material identity, the subtle senses. It's like it merges its sense of smell back into the element of earth, taste back into water, and so on, until it's completely free and purely spiritual. Okay, I know what you're probably thinking. That whole process sounds incredibly complex, maybe even impossible. Well, the text seems to know you're thinking that, because it ends by bringing everything back to a very simple, very accessible starting point. This is the question that's just hanging in the air, isn't it? Is this path only for a handful of people who can dedicate their entire lives to these technical skills? Or is there another way? And here's the big pivot. After laying out that whole incredibly complex path of yogic meditation and departure, the text concludes that the most powerful and effective method is actually just devotional practice, to hear about, glorify, and remember the Supreme. And this final instruction, it's a universal one. Notice that key word there, all. This means this path isn't just for advanced yogis in a cave somewhere. It's presented as a path for everyone, anytime, any place. And this is really the ultimate takeaway. The same purification of your consciousness that yogi is striving for, well, it can be achieved much more directly. Just by filling the mind with spiritual sound, the heart gets cleansed, and our focus naturally turns toward that ultimate goal. And that brings it all back to us, right here, right now. If the most direct path really starts with a simple act of hearing, it leaves us with a really powerful question. Everything we let into our minds through our ears is shaping our consciousness, shaping our journey. So the question is, what are you choosing to listen to?